Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to today's session, and pardon the delay. And we're just dealing with a couple little tech hiccups, but I think we're all rolling online and in person, just not on YouTube, but we will be on YouTube later, so that's fine. My name is Kathy Newhook. I'm the manager of public policy and communications at the Harris Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to this public forum, presented in partnership with the Department of Political Science. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this morning and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territories. Today's session will take a deep dive into the innovative models of citizen engagement and democracy. And more specifically, how some of these models are presenting ways to involve citizens in democracy and decision-making, as well as unpack and find solutions for some of our most puzzling policy issues. I'm really excited about today's session. The Harris Center has been picking away at this space for a long time, picking away at ways to help citizens better engage since it was formed 20 years ago. And it's stated right in our mission and our vision. A lot of the time, we are buried neck deep in the work of that, and don't get a lot of time to really step back and think hard about what else is going on in the space, who else we should be engaging with, and really think about those issues. And so today I'm hoping it will be really helpful. So far, our discussions with Peter have been excellent and very helpful indeed. So really excited to be able to share that with you guys today. So today's discussion, we will have a panel of, aside from Peter, who I'll introduce in a minute, we also have a panel of local experts in their own perspectives. So we'll be able to bring that to the local level as well. And we also have our relatively new still faculty member, Dr. Sean Gray, assistant professor with the Department of Political Science, and an expert on democracy and deliberative democracy in his own right. So he will be joining us to moderate the panel discussion. And also, before I get to introduce today's speaker, we also just wanted to remind you of today's format. We have about 90 minutes for the full session, and we'll start off with Peter for about 20 or so minutes, and then followed by a moderated discussion with our panel, and then we'll be opening it up to questions. So we've got about half of presentation and panel discussion, and then half for a chance for you guys to really ask some questions. And we'll take questions in person here as well as online. Janet is monitoring the online, and so she'll be able to ask any questions that come in through that in the room for us here. And we are recording today's session. Although people in the room, your faces won't be on there, but your voices will. And you can take a look at that afterwards on the Harris Center YouTube channel, as well as the many, many, many other panel discussions that the Harris Center has held over the years. So with that, I can introduce today's speaker. Peter McLeod is the founder and principal of MAS LBP, one of Canada's leading experts in public engagement and deliberative democracy. Since its founding in 2007, MAS has completed more than 200 major policy projects for government and public agencies across Canada, while popularizing the use of civic lotteries and citizen assemblies and earning international recognition for its work. Peter frequently writes and speaks about the citizen experience of the state and the importance of public imagination and the future of responsible government. Between 2020 and 2022, he chaired the Canadian Citizens Assembly on Democratic Expression, just 3 of 50 assemblies he's led. He is the past chair of Toronto's Wellesley Institute for Urban Health and currently serves on the board of Environics, the Environics Institute, and the YMCA of Greater Toronto. So with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Excellent.
You want your slides, don't you?
They might be helpful. Look, it's really quite a treat to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon. I'm grateful for the welcome from an old friend and to make some new ones too. I'm going to try and do sort of two things. I'm going to try and do them a bit quickly, so forgive me for that. So we've got time for all of those questions. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about some of the broader challenges that I think we can all start to be honest about are really, well, imperiling our democracy. And then I do want to talk about these things called citizens' assemblies that I know some of you have a particular interest in, which I don't believe are a full solution to some of these challenges, some of this peril, but can play, I think, an instructive role in getting at the heart of the matter. Given how many of us there are, I'd much prefer to pull off this lapel mic and dim the lights a little, but I'm told all of this tech setup is for the Zoom camera because this is, as you've heard, being broadcast or recorded or whatever else. The title of my talk, if this thing connects, is Democracy's Second Act. Nope. And is there a simple way to make that happen, or should I? Well, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Test it beforehand, and it decides to.
Oh, there we go.
It just needs a little poke.
I had to wake up. So the title of my talk this afternoon is Democracy's Second Act. And I've had the great privilege to be able to travel this country for some time, getting a chance to understand different aspects of our political culture and political history. And the incredible thing is, I think we all fall prey to the idea that what is all that has ever been, and maybe all that's possible as well. We have a tendency in democracies, and frankly any society, to try and build palaces where decisions get made, and we try and build those palaces to look as though they've always been there and will always be there. But inevitably, when I'm traveling across the country, I end up tripping over the last era's palace, the last place we made decisions. And of course, I drove by your colonial office just the other night, and prompted me to quickly school myself up a bit about the evolution of democracy in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the amazing thing is that when you trip over these former parliaments and legislatures that are scattered all across the country, it reminds you that we used to do democracy differently. And I think that's actually an important thing to recall, because it tells us that we probably won't always be doing democracy the way that we're currently doing it today, that we are on a much longer path, and that as wonderful as Mr. Smallwood might have been, and as auspicious and venerable a space as your current legislature might be, the real question that I think we have to ask when we walk into these hallowed chambers, recognizing that they were in themselves a very radical achievement. This isn't to take anything away. It was a hard thing to achieve responsible government, to erect a system of representative democracy, to be able to live with the degree of harmony and peace, to mitigate the conflicts that inevitably erupt, and to put them in a container called a legislature, and see that people can actually more or less profitably resolve their differences. But when we walk into these spaces and we recognize and appreciate what a radical act they might be, we have to ask also what comes next. Because there's certain things that this architecture of representation isn't delivering, that we need our democracies to be able to do. So I'm a fan of the great poet Bob Dylan, who I think was not at all thinking about democracy when he said this, but I think it's a helpful frame, that we're either busy dying or busy being born. And the question for democracies right now is whether we're still busy being born or not. Or do we accept that the legislature that was built here in the 1960s will be the same legislature, will be the same way that we do government 100 years from now and 200 years from now? And is it possible to imagine today's legislature as a midpoint along that trajectory to a world that is not less democratic, though it certainly feels as though that might be the trajectory, but actually a future that is more democratic? And what might that look like? How would that differ? Because certainly to the people sitting in the 1820s and 1830s, a very small fraction of whom ultimately had the opportunity to vote, it would seem incredible to them, the legislature that was built in the 1960s, and it's almost impossible to imagine what it will be in 2100 and beyond. But we have to be confident about our democratic future. We have to be confident about that future in the face of all of the morbid symptoms, right? In the face of all of the hazard lights that have been flashing for some time. Some of my academic friends might know the work of Yasho Munk when he produced his quite galvanizing report in 2017 on what he described as democratic deconsolidation. That's a fancy term to simply say that a breakdown is occurring in our democratic norms. And while we have a very vivid example next to us in the United States, we can also look to what we assume are more placid waters like New Zealand and Sweden, and we see a similar phenomenon. In Canada, though, as John Ibbotson likes to say, things come slowly to our fair dominion, comes here too. And so what you're looking at in this graph is the percentage of the people in any generation who feel that it's essential to live in a democracy. And what this tells you is that those who lived through the war and really understood what was at stake felt very committed to our system of democracy. And those who are further from that galvanizing crucible, they find themselves less convinced of the essentialness of it. And I don't think that's because of all our children are like closet autocrats, right? I actually think it's because the democratic project has itself stalled out. And I think when democracy stops moving forward, democracy, which is by definition a very audacious project of imagination, but when it's not moving forward, the present hypocrisies of that project are laid bare. They're seen by everyone. The ways in which we don't actually hear all voices, that many find themselves excluded. So when I read this graph, it's not that people aren't committed to democracy, they're committed to the way they're skeptical of the way we're practicing democracy today. That we don't have to read this graph just to say, no, we're all headed in an autocratic direction. That said, we do have to be very careful because, as my friend Ross knows only too well, other parts of the world are experiencing real slippage. Up until around 2000s, the trend lines were positive, and we assumed that more and more of the world was going to move from some kind of autocratic regime towards some kind of managed democratic state, ultimately towards liberal democracy. This was the famous end of history argument from Fukuyama. But then we've seen this sort of drop off where those liberal democracies are starting to erode. And we do feel the pressures here in Canada. And so that makes part of my message quite difficult, because I actually think we have to be very clear-eyed and very assertive about protecting the system we have, while simultaneously being sympathetic critics of that system and looking to supersede it. Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves in quite a state. So how would we describe that sensation that we each sit with living in a democracy today and the pressures that we face? It's been described as sort of three Ps, a sense of gloom about that democratic trajectory, that people are feeling pessimistic about the future. Consequently, they turn to false idols. They turn to people who will give easy answers to hard problems. And so we see the rise of populism, wanting to simply step out of the sort of norms and conventions by which we have tried to manage our affairs. And of course, many of us are really concerned about the fact that it seems as though common ground is more and more elusive, and that as a society, we are increasingly polarized. And so this is a pretty tough reality to confront. And that's also why I think we can all, at times, succumb to not only a pessimism, but a real sense of drift, of directionlessness about what is ahead of us. And again, I think that's because the democratic project has not offered us anything new. You know, we went through a period of about 200 years of trying to simply see that everybody gets the vote. And that's been a massive battle. It has never been generously offered. It's been fight after fight, protest after protest, picket after picket, in order to see something put in place that now seems second nature and absolutely evident to all of us, right? But the audacity of that we should just be able to elect our representatives, and that man or woman, property or not, should be able to do it regardless of creed and color and all the rest of it. That was at its time a very audacious claim. Now it's just the norm. But what are the next audacious claims that democracy is trying to put in front of us and that we need to fight for? Well, there's a lot of fighting going on, right? There's a lot of fighting going on. And sensational moments like January 6th show us how precarious our institutions can be and why they need safeguarding. But there's actually a more insidious phenomenon that I think is at work in democracy. And it's been the running down of folks like you and me. It's the running down of the public. And so I want to talk a little bit about that dynamic, and that's ultimately what I want to talk about fixing. So here's where I have to click something, I'm told. How many fans of Parks and Recreation, huh? Okay, I would assume with, you know, political science talk like this. Well, here we go.
They are the men and women on the front lines for improving their community.
Every month, the Parks Department has a public forum, and they always send me. It's pretty cool, whatever. I don't know, I don't care, but it's an honor.
No one else wants to do it. You go to some sweaty rec center and get yelled at by the public. I hate the public. The public is stupid.
From the people who bring you The Office, Amy Poehler in Parks and Recreation.
Thank you so much for coming. What an amazing turnout.
Thursday, April 9th on NBC.
Now, certainly to our elected friends, we have no audience shots, so it's okay. Your identity is protected. But look, it's okay to laugh. It's okay to laugh because we all recognize this. But the fact that NBC could make a sitcom that it then chooses to advertise by showcasing the folly of most of the ways in which a quote unquote mature democracy engages with people tells us that everybody's in on the joke at this point, and that it's actually time to take this as a provocation, not just a source of mirth and entertainment, that we can't go on like this. And we should take seriously the bits of this dynamic that maybe we can fix. I said this to Sean and Kathy earlier, but you take your typical town hall meeting, right? How does that run? Well, you get a microphone, you put it in the middle of the room, you're probably having the meeting far too late, decisions have been made, you've gotten up the nose of a lot of people, they march in, angry as could be about the thing, and then you make them line up after the person at the front has talked way too long. And what I'd like to see is like a nurse with a heart rate monitor and some neural probes, and I want to wire up the people at that microphone, because I'm pretty sure that by the time they finally get to say their piece, their hearts are pumping, their hormones are surging, and yes, there's the thing they're upset about, but there's also the stupid format that has elicited a massive stress response. Because most normal people, they don't do this. They don't like to talk to strangers, right? That's the thing most people feel most uncomfortable about. We got a whole set of jokes in popular culture about what people would rather do than talk in front of a room full of strangers. And yet that's kind of the principal mode by which we do public consultation. So I'm like, mature democracy, really? Really? Is that actually fair to ask of people that the only way that they can communicate to power is in the midst of like a massive stress response? Probably not. The problem is that if we keep repeating these repertoires, we come to see the public as like this. We come to see our friends and neighbors as an abstraction, as folks who are so crazy and so volatile and so ill-informed that the smart thing for a public servant or politician to do is to retreat. It's to see the public as a risk. And one thing that public servants are really good at, and I say this with affection and respect, is that they're good at managing risks. That's what we often pay them to do on our behalf. But there's a big conflation here, because we can't in a democracy see people as a risk. That's really problematic. And people have good noses. They know what it's like to be condescended to. They know when someone's not listening. They know when something's all for show. They know when they're not being told the full story. And how do they respond? They get even more wound up. So we're in a really difficult situation here, because then I'm going to say like broader public sector starts deploying all of their risk management strategies, ways to control the conversation. Rather than ask more questions, we're going to ask fewer questions. Rather than creating more venues for conversation and debate, we're going to have fewer, right? We're going to try and manage people's concerns. We're going to mitigate the issues at play. People feel controlled, pent up. That's if we even care. Because a lot of the time, we're just ambivalent to the public. We're just going to proceed as though their concerns are irrelevant to us. I want to suggest that we're really caught in this dynamic in Western countries. We have to push beyond them, and that the real challenge for us is whether we see the public as a risk to be managed, or whether we have better strategies to tap into their capability as a resource, an essential resource. And you know that there are two ways of managing resources, right? You can either be extractive, it's a bad thing, or you can try and replenish the resource. So when we start thinking about the public as a resource, we want to cultivate that resource. We want to use it wisely. We want to replenish it rather than leaving people feel depleted. This is the sort of schematic conceptually behind what I want to share with you now, which are two strategies that I think are bearing tremendous fruit. The first one called civic challenges, the second citizens' assemblies. You know, back in, I think it was 2015, Canadians started to pay attention to the really horrible circumstances in Syria. And at some point that summer, the photograph of Alan Kurdi, he was that young boy who washed up on the shores of Turkey. And the government, which had, yes, been accepting some Syrian refugees, faced a real public call to do more. And look, if there's something Canada does relatively well, comparatively in this world, it's to bring newcomers to this country and to set them up and on a path to a better life. And we have a very elaborate system of settlement services that helped to do this. But the government had decided that there was an upper limit. There were 25,000 families that could come to Canada in that first wave. And the public, galvanized by that photo, said, we need to do more. And so one of Canada's great social innovations, the Group of Five program, back from the 1930s, got spooled up, thanks to organizations like Lifeline Syria and others that were putting pressure. And before long, we had Canadians who were volunteering with other Canadians to take responsibility for total strangers. And some of you may have been a part of one of these Groups of Five. It's hard to find an audience now that haven't. But the punchline of the story is that we doubled the number of Syrians who could come to Canada, and about 150,000 Canadians, that apathetic public that never turns out to a town hall meeting, that seems too emotional and volatile to trust. Well, they were coming together, spontaneously self-organizing themselves, and without much oversight or the way of programmatic details, raising $30,000, making sure that people were learning English, they were getting jobs, they had housing, kids were getting into school. And now, 8 years later, we know that the folks who were sponsored by Canadians and not those wonderful professional agencies, well, their health outcomes and educational outcomes are at par or better. So to me, that points to a real latent capability in the public that we need to do a lot more to activate. But we'll only activate if we see the public as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And we were so good at this that John McCallum, then the immigration minister, was quoted in the New York Times saying, "My problem, unlike any other immigration minister in the world, is that I can't get refugees quickly enough for the Canadians who'd like to sponsor them." Well, it's interesting. Why wouldn't we expect every government, at least once or twice in its mandate, to issue a challenge to Canadians that activated our problem-solving capabilities, created public value at scale, as something aligned with our values? We had another example to do this during COVID. Government early on set out this call for volunteers. In 72 hours, something like 50,000 Canadians registered all their contact information and said, let me know what I can do. And presumably they were going to do contact tracing. For a variety of reasons, the government never called them. There was that ad in Britain during COVID, you know, the last generation had to fight in the trenches, you just have to sit on the couch. That's the kind of pervasive bullshit that impedes the public's ability to play a much more productive role in our affairs. So there's a vision of the public that can be much more productive in creating public value, but there's also a vision of the public that actually play a much deeper role in trying to address all of the intractable issues that governments find themselves tripping over. Maybe you have this phenomenon. You've elected quite a few Team Blue and quite a few Team Red, and the pendulum goes back and forth. Where I'm from in Ontario, that pendulum swings even more widely, right? And so we spend 10 years doing a bunch of things and 10 years unwinding it, and then 10 years doing it again, 10 years unwinding it, right? It's not a great way of propelling a society forward, but there we go. I've already suggested that a lot of the ways we do consultation happens too late. So even though I'm going to show some new approaches, I want to be clear that a lot of this is just moving people upstream. It's not for nothing that unfortunately a lot of the people tasked in public sector organizations with engagement are also communications professionals. And what do comms people do? They communicate the thing after it's been decided. And so often you end up going through the whole process. We'll define the problem, we'll come up with solutions, we've got an action plan. Oh, does anyone ask the public? Oh, we better go out and check that box, right? And then we're going to have to skew it in such a way that, because it would be really embarrassing if they wanted something different. So it all becomes a bit of a pantomime. We need to move citizen voice upstream. And, you know, Canadians as we are, we don't know our own stories and our own successes perhaps as well as we ought to, because the photo I'm showing you is from Ireland. But the photo I should be showing you is from British Columbia, because Canadians are actually venerated for the democratic innovations that we have been pioneering over the last 20 years. In BC and Ontario, they had assemblies on electoral reform. And we didn't change the electoral system in either province for reasons that have nothing to do with the process. But a very magical and unexpected thing happened. The Ontario Assembly, the academic from Ireland who was there to talk about how they vote in Ireland, got so excited by the process, he went back to Ireland and he said, I think we should try this here. And they set up what are now regarded as some of the most consequential and surprising exercises in citizen democracy that are known to us. The reason why Ireland was finally able to legalize marriage equality and provide access to reproductive services is not because politicians ever found their spine. There were a lot of reasons why the parties were deadlocked on these issues. But they decided that they were going to create a citizens' assembly. They were going to send out letters to randomly selected households and invite people if they would serve and not come out for a town hall meeting, but to actually meet over full days and weekends in a very serious way to hear from the kinds of experts that would typically be briefing ministers and get all the stakeholders to talk to the people. And then once all of that learning had happened, the members of the assembly, they didn't have the kind of easy way out that the folks in the legislature do. They couldn't just take a vote and pass it with a +1, right? They actually had to find consensus, which they did. And the consensus that they articulated much more closely reflected public opinion. And so it created an extra parliamentary mechanism for politicians to support. What this is more colloquially is like, it made the parade the politicians could leap in front of, right? Fair dues. We use task forces and royal commissions and committees all the time to pave the way for good decisions to get made. But citizens don't get to sit at the table. So there are kind of three components to it. The mandate, government saying, hey, we need some solutions here. The civic lottery, and that's the kind of, there are two important aspects to these processes. Who gets to be in the room? We've got terrible ways of convening citizens. Kathy's heard me say a couple times now that you'd never walk by a courthouse where a murder trial is going on and find a sandwich board out front that says jurors wanted. It'd be a terrible idea. You know, the folks who'd line up, they'd all have the hangman's noose with them. It's a bad idea. And yet every time we want to have a consequential discussion about how we organize our health system, how we school our kids, how we invest in big infrastructure, we basically put the sandwich board out front. And the folks who arrive are the folks who've already made up their minds. They're not broadly representative. So we have to be more sophisticated about when we say bring in the public, that it's actually a group of people that represent the public. And then we can't let people off with just that 50% +1. They have to find common ground. And this is the thing about polarization. It doesn't exist. It's a myth. It's absolutely a function of our media and our political structures that drive towards division and incent political actors to play the margins to hold on to 100% of the power by just eking out that slight marginal gain in support. So we've now sent out hundreds of thousands of letters like this. We send them on brown paper because it's more like a tax form. You're more inclined to open it. We get a 1% bump if I send it on brown paper instead of white. But it's got government logos, and you've never probably received a letter like this, because even though we've sent hundreds of thousands, it's still a relatively modest penetration of the Canadian public. And this letter says, we want you not to come tell us what you think, we want you to come and serve. Much like in Ireland, we've been running assemblies to deal quietly with local issues, more prominent national ones. There have been almost 50 of them across the country, dealing, as you heard Kathy say, with government's forthcoming online harms legislation. How do we deal with misinformation? It's a tough one. through to questions around climate, questions around pharmaceutical coverage, questions around drug policy, questions around land use planning. And so we are effectively creating juries of citizens. But they don't just get to say guilty, not guilty. They actually have to provide a path, clear directions that government can follow. You get useful recommendations because they actually correspond, not to what people like or dislike, but to the question at hand. Builds up trust and transparency with government. There's no hiding now. The public sector has to come to the table, not doing that controlling behavior stuff, trying to manage the risk, but more as a partner. And then the best part is that people actually leave feeling really good. We talk a lot about civic literacy, the importance that people should know how a bill becomes law. We like to talk about democratic fitness. It's the Aaron Brockovich school of politics. She didn't know how a bill became law or who her senator was. She had a sense of moral courage and voice and determination to make a difference. It's easy to feel, because we're cultured to feel this way, that politics is a spectator sport. It's for somebody else. We don't have mechanisms that have ever gotten an appreciable share of the population at the table. That's part of democracy's second act. So people aren't giving simple answers to government. They're producing very detailed reports on very complex issues. And if you want a glimpse of the future of democracy today, you go to Belgium. And Belgium is where they've actually set up second chambers of their parliaments, made up of randomly selected citizens. You can get a letter that looked like the one that I showed you with the logo from parliaments that say, would you come and sit on our Standing Committee on Health? And so you've got electeds and selected side by side. And the funny thing is, if you ask the politicians who in any other circumstance might feel threatened, someone's coming on their turf, well, what do you think about having these randoms in the mix? They say, we love it, because you always behave better when you have guests in your house. And it keeps us focused on the long term, not just, what suits our political agenda. So to come back to this point, what's next? We have to do two things. We have to protect the system we've got, and we've got to move beyond it. When I think about our current approach to democracy, as I described to you, we've been fighting for a couple of 100 years, but that fight's not done. Until we get roughly equal numbers of men and women in our political chambers, we're not done. Until we break up the electoral monopoly that our two or three parties have, we're not done, because we've got no means of party and policy innovation. And until we give kids the vote, we've got some major problems of generational equity. And the same arguments deployed against kids voting are the arguments that were deployed against just about everyone who didn't look like me. The second part of this, though, is this agenda around civic democracy, to fill the space between elections with a much more powerful role for people like you and me, to respond to civic challenges, to serve on citizens' assemblies, to replace the pessimism and polarization and populism with optimism, solidarity, and inclusion. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of Canadians on really consequential issues. And it's led me to believe that while people want to say, and they'll pop off in a town hall meeting, they're also willing to serve. But the problem with our democracy today is not that we're asking too much of people, it's that we're asking far too little. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Peter. I love that that last line. I think I've heard it from you before, or maybe in doing my research for this particular session, but it's great. It's such an interesting way to put that. So we're going to move to the panelists. Peter, you can come back up to the panel as I'm introducing everyone else. So we have an excellent panel with us here today. We've got Bettina Ford, is the manager of capacity building and with the Community Sector Council of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's based in Gander. And she has provided training and facilitation for volunteers and people who work with volunteers throughout the province for nearly 20 years. Bettina also has a long history of involvement with municipal politics. At just 21, she was elected as a councillor with the town of Gander. She was one of the youngest municipal officers or officials in Newfoundland and Labrador, and served for 2 terms, 2 4-year terms. Then took a little break, but then she missed it too much. So now she's back again. And she recently returned to municipal government and is now the deputy mayor of Gander. So Bettina, you can come on up and have a seat. We also have Jen Crow with us. Jen is the Senior Director of Strategy, Fund Development, and External Relations at Choices for Youth. And she works at the intersection of impact measurement, government relations, and youth engagement. Jen has led foundational work at Choices for Youth to develop an integrated youth services network across Newfoundland and Labrador, and building from existing youth service site at St. John's and working with over 65 community partners and hundreds of youth to build a model that's focused on both mental health and wraparound services for youth and young families in the province. She also has an extensive background in youth leadership development and rural policy development, community-based facilitation. She's done, I'm trying to skim through based on time. Sorry, Jen. Improvising on your bio, I should have rehearsed that a little. Jen has also been previous chair of Happy City St. John's, and is on the board of the Canadian Housing Renewal Association and the YWCA in St. John's, and does lots of things and has a master's in public administration from Western. Anyway, she's a superstar. Welcome, Jen. And another superstar, and I love when we have all ladies on the panel. It's amazing. Catherine Dibben is a 5th-year student at Memorial. She's a poli-sci and chemistry major, which I think is just fascinating in and of itself. She is keen to mentor young leaders, and especially regarding gender equality and inclusion. She was the co-chair of the Premier's Youth Council from 2019 to 2022, and right through the pandemic. Fun times for her, I'm sure. And co-chair of the St. John's Youth Advisory Council as well, and is currently the governance advocacy specialist, I can't read my own handwriting, and of World Vision Canada Youth Council. So again, superstar, welcome, and thank you for participating. And I'm going to turn things over to Sean Gray. I don't have your bio, but I kind of introduced you earlier. Dr. Gray, over to you, and we all know Peter.
Well, thanks everyone. So we have about 15 minutes for us as a panel to ask some questions of Peter. And then I want to involve all of you. It would be amiss, especially in a discussion about civic engagement, to not take an audience Q&A. You don't have to line up. I think we have multiple microphones, so you don't have to get anxious about that. Well, we only have one microphone, so you might have to get slightly anxious, but only a little bit stressed. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just ask a few questions and I think get a dialogue going that hopefully we can then carry over into the audience Q&A. So I think just a few reactions to Peter's fabulous presentation. Thank you for that, Peter. I think it really sets a nice agenda and crystallizes some of the problems that I've been thinking about and working through, certainly in my work. But the first question I think is for Jen, because I would like to hear a little bit more about the ways in which we might engage traditionally marginalized populations and voices into this re-questioning of civic capacity and how we get more voices in, not only into the conversation, but serving in the way that Peter's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite the question. Thank you so much, and thank you for your fascinating talk. So in my work, I get to think a lot about who isn't included. I work in an organization that serves vulnerable young people, and when we think about vulnerability, we think about that in an intersectional way. About 40% of the youth who we support have experienced homelessness in the last 6 months. We 30 to 40% of the youth who we support have a disability. A quarter of the youth who we support are 2S LGBTQI+, and the list goes on. And I share this because I think it paints a picture of the multiple barriers that these young people experience. And I think that when we think about who gets to be included in democratic processes, when you talk to the young people who we support, they say, well, it's not me, right? If you are worried about where your next meal is coming from, or am I going to get a shelter bed tonight? Am I going to be sleeping rough tonight? Is my kid going to be okay? The last thing on your mind is engaging in democratic processes, even though many of the policy decisions that we make disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. So when I think about this model, I think about the design and the intentional design and what it could mean for folks that don't typically get to participate in these processes. I think I just want to reflect a little bit on my own experiences. I think one of the things that I am continuously humbled by is that we have all kinds of biases on what people who don't look like us or don't have the same experiences as us need. And I think what happens is when we elect people who often come from a certain socioeconomic background, have certain privileges, have certain identities, and they often simply do not represent many of the folks who are vulnerable in our communities. One of the things, just to give you an example of kind of where I was recently humbled, is we implemented, this sounds super boring, I apologize, although there's some academics in the room, so hopefully they'll appreciate it. So we recently implemented a data and evaluation strategy at Choices for Youth. And I was tasked with this, my team was tasked with this. And the first thing I said is, well, I want to ask young people about data. And my executive director, who I think would be okay with me sharing this, I think kind of looked at me and was like, what, Jen? Like, why? Like, why are we asking young people about data? But we did it, and we went out to 90 young people across our organization, and we asked them, what type of data do you want to share with us, and how do you want to share it? And we were absolutely baffled by the results, because we came to this with our own bias, and what young people told us, what my assumption was that youth would say, I want to share my information with you on a tablet, on an iPhone, give me a survey in advance. I don't want to share my vulnerable information with a stranger. But what they told us was the opposite. 80% of them, over 80% of them told us, the way I want to share my information is I want to sit down and I want to have a supportive conversation. That's how I want to share the challenges I'm facing, my goals, my identity, and all of those pieces. And it was just a moment of being humbled. And I think even for me, feeling like, I do this work every single day. No, I don't know what they need, right? And I think this is the situation when we think about legislatures, we think about politicians, is that they often do not instinctively know what citizens and residents need. So I think there is an incredible opportunity here. And I think, the design matters. And when we think about bringing more marginalized or vulnerable people to the table, we need to think about what have been the limiting factors in their engagement to date. And oftentimes that comes from a place of distrust, systems that are supposed to serve them and support them that simply are not serving or supporting them. But it also comes from a place of needing to meet basic needs first. So when we engage young people, we think about, we're going to compensate you. We value your experience, so we're going to compensate you. We're going to make sure you have childcare. We're going to make sure you have transportation. We're going to make sure that it's a space that is for you, designed for you, and not a space that we're welcoming you into that's unsafe. And I think when we can pull together that combination of supports, vulnerable populations and marginalized peoples have incredible things to say. And to me, this is a vehicle for sharing those incredible things.
That's really helpful. And I really like the way you centered some of the background conditions that also have to be presumed for something like this to get off the ground, which is supports for childcare, fair compensation, and so on. So my next question is for Catherine. And it's not an accusation necessarily, but I'd be curious from a youth perspective about your reaction to some of the data that Peter put up in his presentation about declining youth judgments about whether democracy is certainly something vital to live in. And more importantly, I guess I would be interested in your reaction to the model that Peter's proposing from a generational perspective. And I can say that now as an elder of my generation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think back to many years ago when a lot of the times we were fighting for youth councils and fighting for youth to be involved in decision-making process, which of course we still are today, but there are a lot more opportunities that have come about in order for us to share our voices, for us to engage with decision makers, and for us to bring our ideas forward. So I think it's interesting when, 'cause I think youth completely agree. What is different between the youth wanting to be involved versus people of other generations? And yeah, so I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic. I think youth have shown, and they've shown up to really demonstrate that when they are asked, they do want to be involved. We have lots of wonderful things to say. And I think you can even look within our university here. I see lots of students that are here, that the power of the youth voice in this university, it rings strong and you can hear it. And so I think when you ask youth, they're showing up, they're wanting to be involved, and why should that be any different with any other population that we're serving, right? What was the first question that you asked?
It was more of a
about the data.
provocation and an accusation.
I think it's surprising. I mean, we've grown up, and I think there's a huge tendency to accept what you've grown up with and to be able to think radically outside of that while you're fighting for other things that you're trying to integrate into your lifestyle, and saying, I want to be heard, like I want to be listened to, is interesting to do that. So I think it was interesting as a youth perspective to see that kind of decline in wanting to be a part of a democracy, and how youth can kind of radically think about what would it look like where we are integrated, especially when you're below the voting age. What would it look like, how we're integrated, and how can we integrate without that core foundation that has been part of like your civic duty for so long? When you don't have that, how is your participation different?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's usually our youthful energy to get things done that makes democracy something like a barrier to that. And I think that's something we need to work on. Bettina, you're somebody on this panel who's wearing multiple hats, and that's really fortunate for this conversation. You're engaged in capacity building with the Community Sector Council, but also the Deputy Mayor of Gander. And I'm wondering what aspects of both Peter's talk about capacity building resonated, and then the things that we might need to think about more specifically to Newfoundland and Gander that perhaps would, bring Peter's model closer to the work that you're doing, for example.
So I think at one point I actually out loud when you were speaking was like, kind of like, take it home, Peter. Like it was. So I think in listening to you speak, part of what resonated with me, I think I feel like I'm part of the problem, to be honest with you. I was listening to what you were saying, and I've spent a couple of decades in my professional life, my career, working with communities, bringing people together to solve problems. And then in like my side hustle as deputy mayor, you just come to accept these structures that exist. And I had said to Peter on the way in, and I'll just draw attention. So I'm here in the city for the Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador Conference. And I mean, there are 300 approximately municipalities across Newfoundland and Labrador. And I was having a conversation on the way over. Our Director of Legislative Services with the town of Gander, Brad Hefford, left M&L to come here with me. And we were having this conversation on the way over. And, we said, like, that's pretty citizen-led, right? Like in a small province, when you have 300, elected bodies at the local level, that's some significant leadership there and thinking of the community. But we just came hot off the heels of a really challenging open public meeting. I have never experienced anything like it. So a decade on council. And I try to remind myself that what the municipal level of government is dealing with, it really impacts, like I know every level of government, it impacts how you live and how you enjoy your country, your province. But the municipal level of government often makes decisions that impact how people enjoy their home. And so for many people, like their home or lack of, right? Like that is their single greatest investment. It's their piece of the universe and their piece of the world. And I think like that weighs really heavy on me. So we're dealing with a housing situation like many other communities are across Canada. So, we had a meeting and I feel like, we're going about it the right way. But because it affects people's homes and it was involving rezoning of some open space and green space to potentially make room for infill development. So opportunities within the core of the community that are more easily developed, right? So when people come into that, when you put up on the slide there, the emotional, volatile, ill-informed, polarized, self-interested, I turned around and I looked at Brad and I was like, oh my, I actually texted him and I was like, was Peter in the room? Like it was, so, what you said, like what we're doing isn't working. And I felt that after that meeting, we all went away and said like this, what we're doing is not working. So I'll just quickly share an example of where I think we did part of what you're proposing that did work. So with the town of Gander through the health accord and some of the recommendations that came out in that, it was recommended to move obstetrical services from one community in Central, ours, to another community in Central, 100 kilometers down the road. So we instinctively knew that like as municipal leaders, we have to lobby and advocate for the protection of that service in our community, but we knew we weren't the right ones to do that. So I think, Brad, when I look at it, it technically could have been called a citizens' assembly where we reached out. It wasn't completely random, but we reached out to stakeholders and then they reached out to others and they came together in a really big way. So families, parents, doctors, people with family resource centers, like people in the community to whom this really mattered. And so they drove the conversation, right? They ended up, figuring out who was going to be a spokesperson. They mobilized the public. They took on a social media campaign. They had a meeting with the Minister of Health. It was a really, I think we consider it a success. I do anyway. I will reflect on it and say it was one of the better things I think we did as a municipality to let that process be driven. But in the whole housing conversation, I feel like I should not be on the panel. I feel like I should be there taking a lot of notes and learning from what you've said.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. So Peter, I'm going to give you, before we invite the audience for questions, to react to anything you've heard. I also have it in my notes, but I do like putting you on the spot, so I will put you on the spot, to think about and maybe say a little bit more about why Newfoundland and Labrador and why now for civic lotteries. And when you're thinking about your vision for democracy's second act, could you say a little bit more about, maybe based on what you've heard, about what that means for this province here?
Well, I'll take the occasion to kind of sharpen the point on a couple of things that I either alluded to and I think I mic'd up in response to the really lovely responses that I just had the pleasure to hear. When it comes to youth involvement, I think it's right. We haven't had many youth councils and such. That said, given the opportunity, I would blow up every student council in every high school in the country tomorrow, because I think we teach entirely the wrong lessons about democracy from a very tender age. We end up using those student governments largely as an opportunity to reproduce elites. And what we teach let's say a school of 1,000, what we teach the 990 kids that aren't on the student council is that democracy runs just fine without them, thanks. So what would I do? I'd sit down with VPs and the heads of departments in the school, and I'd say, what are the real decisions you're making in the course of the year? And then let's just randomly select students in small groups to come and sit with the adults and make the decision, and then go be accountable and explain it to the rest of the student body. So we'd all learn from that stage that we're all capable of using our brains and we're all able to use our voices, and that we all have to share responsibility for these decisions, which is Not unlike, what former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien used to say about people. Chrétien said, Canadians are reasonable. We are. We're actually a very reasonable, pragmatic people. We don't have outlandish expectations, although sometimes in a certain town hall meeting, it can seem that way. But you know what I hear from people who serve on these assemblies after the first day, after they've had to kind of go through the 101 and the 201 of whatever we're talking about? I had no idea it was so complicated. I had no idea it was so hard. So it's not like assemblies are magic that way, that they can suddenly, be so much more clever than good electeds. It's that it's actually quite sobering to have to sit at the table and understand the complexity of a thing and realize that there are no easy answers. That would be a very good tonic for our population right now, to see that there are no easy answers. Last thing I'll say is, like, part of the problem with our first act of democracy is that our electeds, our parties and leaders, and politicians, they've all gotten drunk on voting. Now that seems like a very strange thing to say. After all, isn't the predicate of democracy voting? No. When we vote is when we decide we're not going to keep talking. So it becomes a get out of jail card. It's like, well, you want A and I want B. Well, let's vote on it. And again, we don't then expect that 80 or 90% of people have to agree. We just need one more. So we'll play the margins. Voting in a legislature or parliament should be better regarded as, like, in case of fire, break glass. Like, if we really can't resolve the conflict, if we really can't figure it out, if I'm going to have to appropriate that home, right, or do something that someone's going to be strongly opposed to, yes, I'm going to exercise my democratic legitimacy as an elected representative. We're going to call the question, we'll vote. But that should be the exceptional circumstance, not the everyday one. So we've just gone way overweighted on one little feature of democracy, and now we pretend it's the whole bag.
Provocative to start the audience Q&A.
Yeah, there you go. And I will answer your Newfoundland question later, though. I'll end on that.
Yes. All right, so I think we have a queue and a microphone going around, and we'll keep a list as well. So happy to take questions, not just for Peter, but for all of our panelists, and based on everything that you've heard. Yeah, we're here, sir.
What's holding us back?
One sec. I'm going to get you the mic so that people online can hear too.
It's not just for Peter, but we have a counselor here, people working in organizations, because this could be used not just in government context, could be used in all kinds. So what is holding us back from having more of these? Because it does seem like a no-brainer. I've known about them for years, and I've always wondered why we're so slow to adopt them. Especially when you said what happened with Ireland, like it seemed it took off there. Why did it take off there, and why is it not taking off here?
Yeah, do you want to briefly respond? Anybody?
Yeah. Sure, okay. So what's holding us back? Well, I think, look, I don't think there are many true villains in this story, right? Like, I assume that a lot of people who go into elected life, they do so with the desire to serve their community and do their best, and we all become prisoners of the kind of systems of which we're a part, and there are a lot of incentives that leave people then to behave and act in a certain way. But as I tried to illustrate, unfortunately, before long, if you're exposed to the quote-unquote public as a potentially hostile and disruptive force, it disinclines you to start trying to, ramp up your democratic ambition, right? But there is also a problem with elites. Elites have never been for putting more seats at the table, right? So now we're in a situation where we don't believe public has anything helpful to say, and actually we're kind of cozy and we're good, so we're just going to keep the power to ourselves. That's why I think we need to actually agitate a bit more. We need to try more things. We need to recognize that there's a need for democratic innovation in government, just as there's a need for innovation in every other industry, right? We'd spend 5% as a minimum on R&D in any going concern. Where's the 5% for democratic innovation in government? Doesn't exist. I think those are my fastest answers.
And if I could just,
Please,
yeah, chime in there, because as you said, as someone elected, I feel like we're slow to change um, because it's hard, right? Like if I'm being perfectly honest. So when you said just a moment ago in your slides about what happens between election, voting day, and the next election and the engagement in between there. And municipally that happens, right? That there's an election and everyone gets all fired up during the campaign and there's a lot of Facebook interactions and the Chamber of Commerce hosts a big debate and there's all the issues bubble up and all these promises are made and you just go off to the town hall for 4 years and it happens all again, right? But I think it's hard. So I liked it when you said about the citizens' assemblies, about when they get the 101 and the 201, or like the 411 on the scoop, because that's the hard part. So like at this public meeting, when we're talking about housing and trying to find a solution, and, a citizen says to me, you are hearing from the citizens of Gander. And by the citizens of Gander, he meant at that time the 30 people who were in council chambers out of about 13,000. He said, you are hearing that the residents don't want this. So your job now is to not do this, right? But then, so I'm thinking, I have a legal responsibility for like the whole umbrella of the entire community. So it's not that I want to like screw your neighborhood and tear down green space, but we don't have anywhere for health professionals to live. We have a crisis with like lower, more affordable housing or lower income housing. We have educational facilities that we have programs in our community that the students who want to come study, who we eventually want to become healthcare professionals in our community, can't find a place to live. And are we at risk of losing that program? So I feel this awesome responsibility. So then I'm spending all this time learning about what levers we have available. So then the residents come in and say, why are you going to do this? There's a derelict building up the road. Just go take that. So then it's the education around that I had to be educated on myself. We can't just go take that. There's laws in place. We can't go bulldoze it. We can't force the developer to sell it. We can't force them to move it on. We can't. So then you have all these constraints. So then it's like you're explaining, okay, so for example, at the municipalities, Newfoundland and Labrador conference in St. John's this week, the town of Gander has to put a resolution on the floor to get the membership to accept that MNL as a provincial body will lobby the provincial government to give municipalities the legal authority to implement a punitive tax on buildings that are vacant, so that we can like financially like punish them or incentivize them to move it along. But the citizens' advice naturally is there's a building, just go take it and make something happen. So I think that's why like a lot, it's hard. And I just guess everyone is so set in the systems that we have. And like, I genuinely want us to move away from the systems we have. And so that's why I said, like, I'm learning here today. This is great. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I saw some hands already. Yeah. Over here, and then we'll go to Gunil.
Just introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Adam Kimmer. And so I'll preface by saying that my question is kind of a comparison between these like virtual citizens assemblies and let's say some kind of theoretical digital virtual assemblies. I imagine with the physical, you get these like human interactions, you get spontaneous conversations rather than like deliberately typed out comments and replies. You can have this kind of like face-to-face conversation in which you can empathize with the person across from you, rather than maybe coming off of Twitter and coming out hot and thinking that everybody is chronically online. And then you also get the focus of like being in this room. And yeah, I've seen pictures of citizens' assemblies and it's obviously a communal thing. And so at the same time, a digital platform, maybe it allows more kind of, it allows people who are stuck at home with kids to be able to contribute, but also people who don't have access to technology can't. So I guess my question is, one, are those assumptions correct from your experiences? Two, is there kind of like an ideal virtual platform that, like, if it existed in its perfect form right now, would be valuable? Yeah, I guess also, like, is this a valid way of doing citizens assemblies just in general?
Well, you expressed all of that very beautifully, and especially about why I think building a rapport between members on assembly is so important. And often I'm asked, yes, couldn't we just do this online? And let me assure you, we had to try during the pandemic because we had set in motion that National Assembly on Democratic Expression, and we sent out the letters February 2020. So by the time we were to convene in the fall, it was impossible, and what was to have been about 8 days in Ottawa and 2 sessions turned into 36 virtual sessions because we had to run them in parallel between French and English and across the 6 time zones. So there's some very basic logistical reasons why it's difficult to do that in this country at a national scale, setting aside the important human factors around rapport and collegiality. But if you want to see how this is being done, I think, well, you'd look at the Polis platform, which is pol.is, and has been used to great effect in countries like Taiwan. Now, this is not a deliberative platform. It's a way to involve people at scale to examine far more options than you ever could through a poll, propose their own ideas, and allow the algorithms and the responses to kind of churn and stew, and ultimately get some kind of sense of where common interests lie. And that's a good deal better than life by Likert scale, which is how we typically measure public opinion today. My point is we need all of this and more, right? A lot more of it. And it's not because I have this belief that people want to spend all of their time thinking about public affairs. The George Bernard Shaw line, the problem with socialism is too many meetings, right? We don't want to spend all of our time in various sorts of meetings. The nice thing is that there are a lot of us, which means we can break the task up. It means that each of us, maybe once or twice in our life, could have the opportunity of serving on the Gander Citizens Commission on Land Use Planning, or could examine youth criminal justice here at the province. And that once or twice experience would sit with people. It would last a lifetime. Just like when you meet people who actually visit the legislature. And it really impresses itself upon them, even if they just have to sit in the bleachers, right? That was the closest they ever got to government. The fact that they talked to a minister. So if we can create opportunities at scale for people to touch the state, the relationship to it, I think changes almost permanently.
That's a wonderful way of phrasing it. So we have Gunell is next, I believe. I'm keeping a queue, and then we'll come down here to.
Thank you, Dr. McLeod, for
Just Pete. It's all right. No doctor here.
And I thank all the panelists here for their contributions as well. Well, I'm a first-year master's student in political science, and I am learning deliberative democracy. And I'm very interested in the design and implementation of these citizen assemblies and public deliberations. And my question is about the initiators of these assemblies. So I believe that the initiative shouldn't come from the government or the politicians, because whenever they are in, they have any interaction with the citizens, they use this they take this as an opportunity to promote their agenda, or for their like election campaign, or for their reputation building, or this kind of things. So I don't trust that. I don't think that the government, it should come from the government or politicians. And then next comes the NGOs, activists, and companies like yours, and businesses as well. So I think that they are also prone to be influenced by their political ideologies. And they're either they have also financial interests or political or social interests as well. So they are not the ideal ones, I think. So then comes, I'm sorry for my long question. So then comes the ordinary citizens that I divide them into three categories. One undercover, and next apolitical ones, and then the good ones, like good hearts without know-hows. And then, so the first ones, they also try for some interests as well, for some public and political figures. And the second ones, apolitical ones, they don't have any interest in political issues. They are like tourists in their own country. And the third ones, they want to do something but they don't know how to do it, or they don't have the necessary means or the skill set to do it. So the question is, who is or who are the ideal initiators of these citizen assemblies? Who should be?
Right. So there's a question about agenda setting, and actually it would be helpful to get Jen and Catherine in on this as well, in addition to Peter, as fellow NGO people with agendas and ideologies.
I can certainly chime in, like just from my own perspective. I think it's a really fascinating question. One of the things that I've been mulling over is, so we do a lot of advocacy work, and we do it with folks like Josh Smead with Food for SNL and many other nonprofit organizations. And the type of advocacy work that we do is thinking about what is it that the folks who we support really need. Things like a basic income, things like a better child and youth services system, things like affordable housing. And I find one of the most challenging parts of doing advocacy work on behalf of clients is making sure that you are accurately representing the needs of your clients. And again, in my example, it's sometimes we do that really well, and sometimes we miss the mark. And I think about the role of citizens' assemblies in being a convener of folks with lived experience who have kind of the equal opportunity to be able to contribute to an end goal, which could then be leveraged by a provincial government or municipal government to be able to drive forward decision making. So again, I'm just thinking about that from my own perspective. I think when we think about the work of nonprofit organizations, they're doing service delivery, but they're also doing a lot of work in trying to agitate and trying to create better systems for the folks who we support. And I'm curious about the role of citizens' assemblies and being able to kind of drive that idea forward. Because again, it's, I think we do our best to represent, but the people who can speak most accurately to what they need are those that are experiencing the challenges with the system directly.
And I'll just add in, at the end, you got to who is the perfect person for this assembly. And I think it comes down to the recognition of that people truly do want to be involved. It's just in different capacities. And I think the interesting fact when we think about this is we're more likely to be a part and follow and push something forward if we've had a role in creating it. So I look at the youth councils that I've been involved on and how passionate youth have come from all corners of this province and all corners of Canada that I've worked with that haven't had the opportunity to be involved before. And they're able to share, they're passionate, and they're like, oh my goodness, I've never knew that things like this were happening, and they get this bug. And they're wanting to come back for more, they're wanting to share, and they're seeing what they're sharing being turned into actual action. And I think that's where it comes from. It's a duality of, we want your time, but we're also going to respect what you're saying, and it's not going to be a tokenistic environment. We're going to use what you are giving us, and we're going to turn that into action, which works great when it does. So I think who's supposed to be on these citizen assemblies? Everyone. But how do we have people that are going to say, I will take the leadership role on this, but I'm engaging the other people that don't want and can't commit that much more time? So how do we engage the unengaged within our society?
I think to answer your question, it helps to recall that innovation always starts at the periphery, and that changes to governance, governing institutions happens quite slowly. And that those of us who are involved in this kind of global deliberative wave, we assume that this is the project of several generations. And there are going to be some stop-starts. There's nothing ideal about nonprofits and businesses and other organizations being at the vanguard here. But we see ourselves as kind of booster rocket that'll get things into orbit. And then when things become embedded, government will do what it always does. It will resource it, right? It will build a new parliament. It'll redesign a council chamber. It will create a set of institutionalized practices. And you will doubtless be very damning and disappointed with them. Because government democracy will always break your heart. But what we want are better problems, right? And I think what these processes do is set us on a trajectory for democracy to have better problems than we have right now. And then we'll keep beavering away to address all of those shortcomings, and we'll keep going from there. But, you know, to address your skepticism about government commissioning, government should commission because government can act on the recommendations. And if we do a bunch of assemblies as like thought exercises without it translating into any kind of policy impact, then people are going to say, well, what's the point? That said, in Belgium, I said it's the future of democracy. Those people who are seated at that table, they're randomly selected citizens, and their job is to meet, to decide what the topics will be for 2 other citizens' assemblies that take place each year. And the kinds of topics that those citizen-created citizen assemblies examine are usually the issues that are really consequential but overlooked. So, youth mental health, adults in care. They then do really hard stuff in the way that we've often turned to royal commissions to look at outside of our political cycle to tee up the next political program.
So I don't want to break too many hearts. So what we're going to propose that we do, because we have a limited time left for this panel, is to collect a bunch of questions, and then hopefully we can respond very briefly, and then continue the conversation in an informal reception just after this event. Take maybe two more questions, 3 more questions.
I think we were kind of heading in this direction in this conversation. So I'm sold on the model, like on citizens assemblies and on the value of it, where like maybe my own skepticism or where it comes in is like the mechanism of connecting that into existing democratic institutions, right? Like how, I guess, how do we take what the good work that's coming out of these assemblies and how do we integrate that into our political process? Like I'm thinking back to the Ontario referendum. The Citizen Assembly did a great job, but then it went out into the like more traditional political sphere and it crashed and burned super hard. I was campaigning in that one, and it was really clear that no one was prepared for the moment that it became like capital P politics, you know?
Right.
And like, so I'm just thinking about that, like, what are the mechanisms to kind of insulate what's coming out of these more deliberative processes from the bullshit that still exists in the structures around them would be where my head goes.
And there was 2 questions back there, Kathy.
Thank you very much. I'm sold on it, so I'll just say it right up front. I think the process would be super. I've been involved with both politics, but also on the side with persons with disabilities. And I'm thinking of the concept and going back to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. What came out of that was an assembly of people, but really it was a citizens' assembly. But what came out of it was nothing about us without us. So I think what you have is exactly what that is. And I think it's one of the missing links within our democracy, without question. And from the democracy side, I'd like you to answer this in some way. In the previous administration here in Newfoundland, we had 70% of the cabinet representing 30% of the people. How do you how do you deal with that, or do you call that democracy? But I know all the work of the community groups that are going on, and within, I also know that they have what's called Engage Newfoundland and Labrador, Engage City of St. John's for your input, but it's not real. A citizens' assembly would be real. Thank you.
One last one.
One last one.
I'm sorry, you guys.
Hi, Edward. I'm part of this institution. So I already know now you want to blow up the student councils in the high school and grade schools around the province. But, you know, this institution of higher learning, I actually have seen no evidence whatsoever of general engagement on matters of great concern to the institution. So my question to you is, have you in your organization had any success in dealing with these kinds of institutions?
Nice and succinct. I'm going to squeeze in one more, Sean. Sorry.
Okay.
My prerogative. I have the mic back here.
Thanks, Peter, for the presentation. I think you were getting at this, but just one quick question. From your experience and maybe research, is there anything inherent in the approach of the Citizens Assembly that ensures that maybe there's a resilience or longevity for the decisions that are adopted under that approach that might make them immune to future changes in subsequent governments?
So I'm going to invite Peter and then all of our panelists to deliver some final thoughts with the idea that this isn't going to be the end of the conversation. There is an informal reception that we'll have just after, so we can continue the conversation. So let's have some conversation starters rather than enders.
I'm going to try and move with haste because those varied questions would require a good 20 minutes or so to get through. On the topic of universities, I think this process is very well suited to universities. Universities have their own constituencies. They have their own publics. There's been some experimentation like town gown assemblies to resolve certain tensions. There have been efforts at UVic, at BARD. They're trying to create assemblies right now, so I think could be done very, very well and very, very easily. I think in terms of the policy impact, you know, when you're designing these assemblies, the principal design criteria is legitimacy. What will work to augment the legitimacy of this exercise in order to ensure that the recommendations are adopted and protected longer term? That varies circumstance by circumstance, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It's a little bit like too hot, too cold, just right. You know, you really have to be able to take the measure of the thing in order to design a process that is going to command that respect. It's not that there's euphoria that breaks out when the recommendation is announced, right? What you're trying to ensure is that even if people don't like the outcome, they respect the process, right? And so then they're going to go along. On this bit about Ontario and BC, like, hey, we had these two assemblies and we didn't change the voting system, what of it? Let me just say that if you were trying to introduce a new democratic process to a jurisdiction, the single worst topic you could choose would be one that presupposed to rewire every political incentive by which politicians had organized their professional lives, right? Quite reasonably, the feeling amongst many legislators was, who the hell are these people, right? And I had the chance to speak to almost all of them in Ontario one-on-one as I was organizing those student assembly meetings. And many of them confessed that they didn't really understand what the Citizens Assembly was, and they actually didn't really understand how some of the other electoral systems worked so well. And you know, that taught me a very powerful lesson about the importance of legislative relations being as important in these processes as they are in any other stakeholder exercise, and that we shouldn't take it as a given that the electeds understand things as well as we might assume. And I say that with a lot of respect because they've got so much coming at them. But look, we have seen now 48 other assemblies in Canada for various levels and jurisdictions really deliver some important legislative or regulatory changes. And you know, I just want to point that out, that when we talk about a deliberative wave, we're talking about citizens' assemblies. When we look around the world, we see them operating in three key ways. In Ireland, yes, dealing with some intractable, generational, quasi-constitutional issues that politicians, they couldn't touch the third rail. So why did they catch on in Ireland? Because it was an effective mechanism to deal with that issue, right? But those constitutional issues, they only come up periodically, right? It's not enough to sort of aerate our political systems. And that's why the Belgian use of these processes is really cool. Okay, let's renew our parliamentary democracies by bringing people to the table. But even then, that's only going to allow a few dozen more people, you know, into the palace. What about everyone else? Well, there's a lot of government out there, but it's not big G government. It's the broader public sector. And the chief executives of those organizations, they've got all kinds of difficult issues all the time where they feel jammed between a rock and a hard place. No easy answer. Well, that would actually give us the scale to bring far more people to the table if we were using this in our school boards, our conservation areas, our transit authorities, our health systems, on and on and on.
So I'm conscious that we're over time, but I do want to, any last reactions from Jen, Bettina, and Catherine?
I can go first. I'll just quickly say, I think engagement is engagement, but authentic engagement will give you results. So I think that's something to keep in mind. We can engage as much as we want, and citizens can say as much as they want, but we need authentic engagement, and we need a recognition that we're asking people for their advice and for their information, and we're going to use that in order to make the results that they want to see. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're grappling with a lot of complex challenges in our society right now. Like, I mean, if anyone drove down the Parkway, you would have noticed that we have an encampment in our city for the first time in a public encampment in the city for the first time in kind of recent history. But I think complex problems require multiple solutions. And I think you acknowledge that, Peter, right? That this isn't a silver bullet. It's part of the solution. And I think, you know, we can all agree that we still want to see, we have the worst representation of women in our legislature of any province in our country. We need to change the dial on that as well. And we need to change the dial on our broader political systems. I think that this paired with things like election finance reform, supporting more people, more diverse folks getting involved in politics, and also looking at our bureaucratic systems. Like, it is an incredibly slow moving process, and it stifles innovation. And I think we can do better while also looking at these tools, right? And I think what I'm really feeling coming out of this conversation is that this is a mechanism to value and to think differently about what is expertise. You know, and I think really valuing the experience that citizens and residents bring to the table as true expertise. And I kudos, Peter, to you and your model. I think that really drives that home.
So in my work with the Community Sector Council, in building the capacity of the nonprofit sector, we do talk a lot about governance and effective governance. So it really struck home for me when you talked about the way our system is designed with the vote yes, vote no, someone wins, someone loses. So we actually talk about in nonprofit board governance structure, consensus building, you know, and that people think consensus means everybody agrees, but we're like, no, it doesn't. It's like, you know, to what degree can you live with a decision, right? So I think that, you know, there might be ways for us to play more with that at the different levels of government. But I just want to say, like, sorry, I know it's not all about me, but my soul really needed this today. Like, my elected, honestly, like, I'm looking at Brad. So what we experienced, it's almost like coincidental, serendipitous, I don't know what the right word is, but to be here today with all of you and to see your interest in this and to hear people and to hear your questions. I mean, I do believe most elected officials want to do right by their communities. So this has really invigorated me. And, you know, I look at the town of Gander. So when you talk about civic challenges, the Syrian refugee crisis, we had families in our community who flew into action. And we have families who came into our community. They're still in our community. They own businesses. Like, I mean, they're doing really well in our community. And every person, I think, knows what happened in Gander during September the 11th, that during 9/11 and the terrorist attacks, our community, you know, the civic challenge was our population doubled. And how do we feed and house people? So we're dealing with a housing crisis, and Brad and I walk away from very bureaucratic situations of trying to create emergency shelter. And, you know, Brad on the way out is like, Jesus, boys, like, you know, we fed and we housed and we clothed and found underwear for 10,000 people. Surely, you know, like we can find a way to come together around homelessness in our community and to find some solutions when we have time to plan. like we did that with no time to plan. So like, what's wrong that we can't fire everybody up about this? So I would love to see Gander, you know, this time next year to be able to say that we piloted or tested some kind of a citizens assembly around some of these big issues that as a council, we don't take the time to address because you're chugging along with government, right? So I'd like to be able to report that to you, Peter. We'll see.
A civic challenge in its own right.
There you
And please
go.
join me in thanking all of our fabulous panelists and Peter McLeod for being here.
Make it happen. Yeah.
So there's a reception outside. There's drinks, there's coffee. Please feel free to approach the panelists